Welcome to the Actually I Can Female Entrepreneur podcast. I am your host, Kayleigh Greenacre, a business strategist, coach, TEDx speaker, author, and your go-to woman for all things business strategy. I am obsessed with supporting female entrepreneurs to grow unstoppable six and multi-six-figure businesses that they love, giving them the freedom and life that they desire. During this podcast, I'll be sharing with you everything that you need to become a successful female entrepreneur, from the mindset shifts to sales and marketing strategies and how to become an iconic leader that people can't get enough of. It is my mission to help you stand out, attract your dream clients and customers, and sell out of your offers with ease whilst building the business and life of your dreams. Let's make this your reality, ladies. Hello, ladies, and welcome to another episode of Actually I Can, the Female Entrepreneur Podcast. And I'm joined today by the fabulous Jenna Farmer, who is a PR expert. And we are going to be diving today into the mindset and goals needed to put yourself out there and get into the press. Jenna, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Really excited to dive into the mindset side of getting into the press and all things PR related as well. Before we dive into some of the questions and the topic itself, do you want to give our listeners a little bit of a background to you, your story and your journey?
Yeah, so I'm a PR, so I help people get all over the media. And my journey started quite a few years ago now. I was living abroad. And I used to be a teacher, so I was living abroad, teaching in China, and I was unfortunately diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And because I was sort of far away from home and away from my support network, I started a blog to sort of share my experiences, and that was like my sort of step into the media. So I started a blog, I started creating content and talking about it online. And then when I did come back home to England a few years later, that blog had grown a little bit of a following, and some articles that I've written were picked up by the press. And that allowed me to leave my job as a teacher and start writing for the media on all sorts of topics, but mainly about chronic illness. And then after, so many people saying to me, like, how have you sort of PR'd yourself? Like, how have you got this role in the media? Started writing for the press, seen all these benefits, like more followers, I had a book deal, all of those different things. Can you help me do it too? And that's when I transitioned into PR, helping businesses, tell their own stories and get their own benefits from PR, just like I've done for myself.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today. And I know that there's probably so much more to that journey, and I'm really, really excited to dive into your expertise in regards to PR, because this is something that a lot of people are very interested in. And I know there's so much benefits to, as an entrepreneur, to really getting seen in the press, getting yourself into the press, and allowing yourself to be more visible and be seen. But I know also there's a lot behind it when it comes to things such as mindset and visibility, and potentially even imposter syndrome to an extent as well. So let's start off by looking at mindset. Is there anything, or what mindset shifts would you say are essential for people who want to be seen in the press, but they're afraid of the visibility side of things?
I think the first thing is it's really important to change your mindset away from how am I going to get promo for myself? How am I going to sort of get all this PR? And instead thinking about how can I create really valuable stories? How can I show journalists how helpful I can be? And I always, with my example, obviously my stories were picked up in the beginning, but I didn't know anyone, like I didn't have any contacts. I had no connection at all to London or the media world. But what I did have was a story. And if you've got a really great story and you come across as, I've got this, it's going to be really helpful to your readers, it's going to be expert content, it's going to be a story they can relate to. If you change that mindset, then you will, as soon as I figured that out, I would pitch anyone, because I was like, this is a story that needs to be told. This is advice that needs to be listened to. So really see it as, rather than, trying to get the journalist to buy your thing or to, get all these different mentions, you've got a really great story. You've got, just like you're helping people, whether that's on Instagram, a podcast, social media, you're helping people and creating valuable content. So why not, get that valuable content and help as many people as possible by getting it into the media?
I love this. And I love how, really leaning into their story. And this is something that I'd love to ask you as well, because back when I very first reached out to a PR expert about being seen in the media, this is before I was introduced to you many years ago. And I really wanted to dive into the PR side of things. And I thought it'd be really, really beneficial for me and my visibility. But I was that person where I said to the person at the time, I was like, I don't think I've got a good enough story. I haven't got a rags to riches story. There's nothing special about me. I am who I am, but I'm really, really passionate about what I do. And I remember the expert that I worked with at the time a couple of years ago, she was like, but there is so much to your story. You haven't picked out those key elements. And obviously she helped me over time to kind of really identify what that story is. So there may well be listeners who felt the same as I did back then. Is there any advice that you can give around that? Because I do think that sometimes when we look at some of the stories in the press, they are extremely like big stories, but everyone has their own story to tell. So is there any advice that you could give to our listeners around picking out your story or how to identify it?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the most common things that I hear, like I'm not interested enough, I haven't got a big story, or, like I'm not earning six figures, so I don't have that big transformation piece. And what I always say is that, of course, there are those stories that are super dramatic. And even if you've got one of those stories, you don't have to tell it. If it's uncomfortable to you, don't feel as if you have to relive something that's traumatic to get into the media. But as well as those big stories, we know the stories that work really well are things that create a connection, things that are a universal experience, and things that are in the everyday. So, in my case, I wasn't the only person in the world with Crohn's disease, but I was sharing about what it was like, and people were sharing that with friends and, really relating to that and connecting to that. My son's got autism, so I've talked about that in the media a lot. Now, there's loads of parents out there whose children have autism. So again, that's not a really unusual story, but it is a story that is relatable, that is connected, we can create a connection with, that creates some sort of emotion. And you have to think about, you've got those stories that shock you and surprise you, but you've also got those stories, and you'll probably see them every day, where you'd forward them onto a friend and say, this was useful, or you tag someone and say, have you read this? And that sort of story is really, really beneficial to newspapers and magazines because they rely on online traffic. So if you've got something, it can be a really simple thing. Some of my experts have shared a simple thing they do each day that improves X, Y, Z. And people love those sorts of things. So as well as the big and the dramatic, it can also be the really simple, the really mundane, the everyday that people can relate to and learn from. It might be, I've read stories, someone that just said they followed this one tip each day for a month and how that improved their life. It can be really simple things, but because we just assume it can be the big things, we're put off by sharing just the more ordinary parts of our life.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like I said, I completely resonate with what you said there, and just thinking about where I was when I asked that question a couple of years ago. So for someone who potentially is just starting to look into PR, who doesn't really know where to go with this, is there any advice that you can give them at the very beginning stages, whether it's about crafting their story or whether it's about how to approach it? What advice would you give them?
Yeah, I definitely start with coming up with a story, because if we haven't got a story, then we are just trying to get promo and just sort of reaching out and crossing our fingers, which is never a great strategy. So coming up with a story. So I usually say, divide the stories that you could create into 3 different categories. The first one is your lived experience. So just everything we talked about there, things that part of our life that people can relate to, that people feel an emotion to, that we create connection to. That's a good place to start. The second type of story is your expert story. So those are the 5 tips. Here's the mistakes you might be making. Here's one thing to do to solve this problem. And the key to those are things that are accessible and achievable and solve some sort of problem. So if you was a mental health expert, rather than saying here's 20 different ways to solve anxiety and all this therapy that you're going to need, and you're going to need all these supplements, maybe you just take one thing and say this 5-minute exercise is going to help you feel more centered before you go into a work interview. So we just narrow it down to be specific, something that anybody can do. So try and remove some of the barriers such as, having to invest in lots of things, or, having to spend hours and hours on something. Try and remove the barriers and take what you do and turn it into something that is simple, accessible and achievable, and offers, some sort of problem in little time. So you'll see these all the time. This 5-minute hack is going to make you look 5 years younger. This 10-minute exercise is going to help you have stronger leg muscles, whatever it is. That's the sorts of things the media loves. So if you can take what you do and break it down into those things, that's really helpful. And then the last type of story is something that is timely and newsworthy. So all this means is just keeping an eye on what's being spoken about. Sometimes it'll be, let's say you're an education expert and there's breaking news regarding like the VAT measures on private schools. That would be a perfect time to sort of raise your head and say, look, I can be the expert here. Other times it could just be the time of year, like we've got Valentine's Day coming up as we record this. If you're a relationship expert, that would be perfect for you. Other times it can be just what people are talking about. If you're scrolling on TikTok and everyone's talking about this new trend, reach out and say, I've got expert comment on this new trend. So, really simple things that you can do for that, like scrolling on social media, setting up a Google alert. I don't know if you've ever set one up for yourself. Have you ever set up a Google alert?
No, I haven't actually.
So all you do is go to google.com/alert. I don't know if it's alert or alerts. I'll just check actually. Yeah, alerts with the S on the end. And it's good to first of all just type your name in, because then whenever you're featured in the media, Google will send you an email for that alert. So when you are going to do PR, that's really handy. But in the beginning, it's really good to put topics in. So, let's say that I am a menopause expert. If I put menopause into Google Alert, then every time that is written about, whether it's a new study, like a new survey, a new angle, it will send me that email. So then I've got loads of things that I can contribute to. And I do this all the time. Like I'll reach out to a newspaper and say, there's just been this breaking news story today, like my client can talk about it if you need ideas, an alternative viewpoint, expert comments, or so on.
Yes. Amazing.
So if you can follow those 3 steps, then already you'll have some stories, and that's sort of the most important place to start.
Absolutely. Because once you've got your stories, they then have something to be able to share. So then what's the next step? Say they've crafted their stories, or they've got the 3 different types of stories or different angles, which you've just kind of explained and talked through. Then what should they do?
So then obviously we need to email it to someone. Otherwise we've just got a list of stories and we've not done anything with it, which doesn't work. You have to actually do something with the stories. So the next step then is to reach out. So there's a few different stages to this. The first thing is, like, I always really recommend people just take their time to read things. So, like Forbes is a big one. Like I was talking about this at an event yesterday. Everyone says they want to be in Forbes. Very few people read Forbes and figure out the different sections, the different journalists. You sending a press release or just like, let me tell you about myself to Forbes is not going to get you anywhere. We need to figure out the exact stories they cover, how they speak to founders, what topics they cover, so we can find that right match. So reading publications just to get a feel for like who they are, what they cover, and the sort of style, the tone really, really helps. And the more specific we could be. So let's say we wanted to be in Grazia. Looking on their website, what different sections do they have? I'm a business expert, so let's look at the career section. Then I'm going to notice maybe this one journalist writes all the careers articles. So that tells me she's the right person. So it's just about taking the time to research the publication, see who the right journalist is, and also see if it's the right fit for you. So that's really important before you do the next thing, which is obviously send an email. Now, what I always say with the email is obviously it's going to depend a little bit on what you're pitching, but just answer these 4 questions is what I always say. First, just tell the journalist who you are really succinctly in a sentence or 2. And just remove like the sales language and the copywriting language that you might use online. Just keep it really factual. Like, I'm Jenna, I'm a PR expert that works with businesses to get them in the media. That would be it for that. Then you're going to let them know like why you're emailing. And a personal connection really helps here. So if you can maybe reference the magazine, the section of the magazine, maybe even like, I've read this article and I've got a new take on it. So just showing the journalist that you actually know what the sorts of things they write about. Then you're going to sort of tell them how you can help. So again, it's not like how you can buy from me, how can I help you? So it could be, I've got an idea for an article and this is what it's going to cover. It could be, I've got a product and like, I'd love to send you some, and like, here's where you can find the images. Whatever it is, how you can help them, what you'd like to offer them, whether that is an article, some quotes, an introduction, a product. And then we always try and make sure that we weave in why now. So why is now the best time to tell this story? So let's say if we have like an entrepreneur, like a business strategist, because that's quite a general one. And she's probably got all these different business strategy topics that she could talk about. But why now? So she might have a look, are there any stats that show that, the number of people starting their own business is up by like 200%? Or is it that, like February is the time where lots of people quit their jobs? Whatever it is, trying to explain an angle. Or it could just be, like the government say that so many people are working from home and people don't want to return back to the office, so people are starting their own business. So whatever it is, just letting the journalist know, here's the hook. This is why now is the best time to write this story. And if you can do those 4 things in your email, then you're going to be probably better than 90% of people that are emailing. Because as a journalist, because when I was a journalist first, the majority of people did not do those things. So just doing those 4 things will really help.
Amazing. So for those that are listening, make sure you follow those 4 simple steps. Such incredible advice as well in terms of how to approach it and exactly what to include. Because like you said, Jenna is the absolute expert at PR. She knows what journalists are looking for. So absolutely take her advice on this. So I want us to imagine then, Jenna, that some of our listeners have done that. They've crafted their stories and angles. They've looked for the best journalists to approach, and then they've put together the email, they've sent the email, and then nothing. Now we know that is pretty normal. That can happen time and time again to people. But I think that could play a massive part on people's mindsets, and maybe people will start questioning if they're doing the right thing, etc. Is there any advice around, I wouldn't even necessarily call it rejection, but around how to handle that when you're consistently trying to approach and apply for features within PR?
Yeah. So this is like a really common problem, because what people tend to do is they tend to spend like an hour on that first email, like really poring over it. So that's the first thing you can't do, because if you spend an hour on every email, it's never going to take off and be sustainable for you to get coverage. So scale it back, like just answer those 4 questions that I said. But what people do is they spend an hour and then they get no reply, and they think, well, that was a complete waste of my time. And then they give in. As soon as people get 1 yes or 1 piece of coverage, then it just falls into place, because they feel like they're media worthy and they're entitled to be pitching. So I shared something on Instagram the other day that said, like, you didn't stop your business on day 1. Presumably when you started your Instagram account, you had no followers in the beginning, but you just continue to do it. And why then? You sent a few emails and then you've just decided that PR isn't for you. You have to give it time. You obviously don't want to be sending out hundreds of emails and getting no reply. If that's the case, then we need to go back to the drawing board. Have you had the email clear? Has your subject header been clear? Is your story strong enough? But if you're just sending, literally, I had a call with someone the other day, they sent 2 emails. You can't give up that easily, because you wouldn't give up in any other angles of business that easily. So you have to persist, but you have to make it a daily habit. So which is why I think you need to get it down to 5 minutes an email. And then if you spend 5 minutes every single day for a month, even if you only got a couple of replies, that's 5 minutes every day. So immediately, like, the stakes are lower, like the investment feels lower, and then you're more likely to continue to do it. So you have to make it a daily habit. You have to sort of take the pressure off. It's not about a perfect email. There's loads of things you can do to make it quicker. You could write like a template. So you use that template each time and you just tweak it for the publication. But you have to you have to be consistent, you have to keep going, and you also have to follow up. And I know that we talk about following up in business.
Yes.
It's even more so with journalists, because it's not even about sales and things like that. Journalists get hundreds of emails a day. So sometimes following up just statistically improves your chance of being seen by them. So you have to get into the habit of following up. And usually I will do that like 3 to 7 days after the email. And yet you need to keep on top of it, because it's the following up, it's the doing it consistently that will really help. You are going to get ghosted, because I get ghosted, and it's literally my full-time job, and it's something that I think I'm really good at. But we still get ghosted because journalists are getting hundreds and thousands of emails a day, and they might not be working on what I'm working on right now. And so many journalists share with me that because their inbox gets so busy, they use it as like a search engine now. So, if I pitched them the menopause expert, but they weren't working on it, but next month was Menopause Awareness Month, they would just search menopause and my email would come up. So it's becoming more and more common where I'll get an email that was, I sent out 2 months ago saying, can you still help me with this as well? So if you haven't got an instant response, don't always feel, like it's a complete no, but follow up. Do it consistently. If you're listening to this and you've sent the same story like 100 times, then try a different story, because the idea is we just need to keep coming up with new ideas.
I love this. And consistency is key, like you said, in any aspect of your business. But I think if people were to, find that little bit of time, like you suggested, just even 5 minutes a day, where they're prioritizing PR and really focusing on how to contact or adapting or amending their story, or not even necessarily the story, but for certain applications or emails to journalists. I think that will really, really support people and help people. Is there anything that you recommend to your clients, that not your clients that you work at a high level with, where you really support them with this side of things, but those potentially that are doing it themselves? Is there any advice around that of how to stay consistent and how to keep on top of that? Or is there any sort of system or anything that you have that might be able to support some of our listeners with this?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So the prep really helps. So like I say, having some templates, this is the email that I send for a podcast. This is the email that I send for an article. This is the email when I'm replying to a specific request. Having some templates and then just literally tweaking it to personalize will really help. But I also really like batch creating the actual content, because for a lot of service-based businesses, the big part of their PR is going to be like the expert quotes. So for you, it might be like, sharing mindset tips and like things like that. So having like a spreadsheet where you collate all of the things that you could share with the press, and you can repurpose this from blogs, from Instagram, from LinkedIn. And it's just a quote spreadsheet where I put the topic, a paragraph quote, and then if, like in my case, if I literally can't get hold of a client, they're really busy, they're in meetings, I will just take the quote and send it over to the journalist. But for people that are in my membership and doing their own PR, they can just take the quote and copy and paste it and send it over. So it means that if there is a tight deadline, they're not having to create something from scratch every single time. But in terms of like managing the flow of it, I also recommend setting up a separate email address, like press at or PR at your name or whatever your website is, because that way you can see really easily the emails that you've sent, and then you can spend, maybe every Tuesday you go through each email and follow up, or, you can flag them. If you're not going to do that, then you maybe need some sort of spreadsheet to track your pitches. But a lot of people do that, but it's so much easier, I think, just to have a separate email address, and then obviously all your pitches will just be on that one email address anyway. So that means that when you're pitching, you can just focus on that, and you've got no other emails coming in. You can check your follows, you can check your sent emails easily and follow up, and it just makes it a lot easier, in my opinion.
Amazing. And when it comes to, putting together their processes, etc., and finding certain ways to do this on a regular basis, if they're having absolutely no luck whatsoever and they've been at it for a couple of months, for example, what would you recommend to someone if they're in that situation?
If they're going consistently and they've had no luck for a couple of months, it's probably going to be down to either the way that they're pitching or their story idea, because a lot of people get really, focused. Let's say you've got a book, for example, because we met at a book lunch not long ago. So let's say you've got a book, and sometimes you can be so focused on, I'm just going to email every journalist and tell them about my book and, see if they want a copy. But the thing is, if you're not getting replies, then we need to think of another angle. So, okay, can we do a giveaway with the book? Can we write an exclusive excerpt from the book and promote it? Can we come up with an angle that's timely? And I think that's one of the biggest things. People just keep going and keep going with the same story. So, absolutely try different places. But like with the types of story I talked about at the beginning, hopefully you'll be doing all those types of stories. So don't just focus on the thing that you're selling. At the end of the day, bluntly, you have to ask yourself, like, why would a journalist care about this? And it has to come back to because it's a great story. So if you've got a book, that can be the vehicle for so many different stories rather than I've written a book, which is amazing for the person that's written it. And it's such a big achievement. But the journalist doesn't know you or care about that because they want the story. So I think that's one of the biggest things. Of course, then you might, I don't believe that everyone needs like one-to-one PR. So, but you might see if someone could like look over your story or give you some insight because it might be also the way that you're pitching. And the common thing that most people, if they're not getting results, will show me their pitch. Straight away, it's just way too long. They're just telling the journalist all about their life. It's not actually clear what it is. And I think this is a massive problem in the business world in particular, because I did an Instagram post a few weeks ago and I asked people to tell me what they were in one line, like I'm a PR expert. Yeah. And the number of replies I got that I just didn't know what that meant. And they would say, oh, okay, well, that's fine because you're not my ideal client. But the journalist isn't your ideal client, So I always give the example of like, let's say you're like a funnels and launch specialist. Like most people that listen to the podcast would know what that meant. Let's say you wanted to be in stylist. The stylist journalist doesn't know what that means. What does a funnel and launch specialist mean to them? So they might call themselves an email marketing expert. Yeah. It's the exact same thing, pretty much. And obviously, I'm not telling you what to call yourself, but I think people are so focused on, what they call themselves and telling the journalist. It's a really useful exercise to just ask somebody that's not in your audience, do you know what this means? And about a quarter of the people, I said, I just don't understand what this means. So I'm just the average person in this case. So that can be a really useful exercise because sometimes we're trying to explain a difficult concept to a journalist it goes back to like your knowledge isn't common knowledge for everyone. So are you trying to explain something that is like amazing to you and your audience, but actually needs to be broken down, way more? I do the PR for like a longevity expert. And a few years ago when we started, it was really hard because it was quite a new concept to the UK, but I was using all these scientific words and no one understood the scientific words. So I had to go back to the expert and say, okay, what does this mean? Okay, well, we know studies that show if you have a cold shower, like that can be one way to help your immune system. And we know that in certain cultures, they practice sitting to stand a lot more, and that's good for your health. So we really, really broke it down. And I think we're so passionate about our expertise that especially service businesses, the biggest thing people do with service businesses is they just tell the journalist everything, all the topic ideas, and they forget that it goes over the journalist's head. So it's either too long, it's too specific, it's too, niche. And of course, if you're pitching like an online business magazine, then maybe like a launch and funnels expert makes sense. But for the average publication, it doesn't. So I think just getting someone else outside of your audience to have a look at your pitch and say, by the time that the journalist reaches the end of the first paragraph, they should know exactly what the email is about. So if they don't, then immediately you've lost them. So just really simple things like that will make a big difference.
Like you said, getting someone else's eyes, maybe outside of the industry, just to kind of understand or at least say their opinion. Do they understand who you are, who you serve, what you do, and obviously a little bit about your story as well. Yeah, this is great advice. And just something you touched on there in terms of online magazines, and I know you touched on Forbes earlier, but I would love to know if some of our listeners are really looking to explode their visibility this year and they really want to dive into the PR side of things. I know there's probably not going to be one set answer for this, but what would you recommend them doing when it comes to the types of media? So we look at, podcasts, radio, TV, online, press, print, etc. Is there any advice that you would give to our listeners if they really want to explode their visibility this year?
So I always say the first thing to think about is actually the strategy before you begin. So if do you know where like your current customers are coming from? Like if you know that a lot of them are coming from podcasts, for example, then it would make more sense to focus on podcasts. Then you think about, okay, what am I actually good at? So, there's some people, some of my clients have to literally like drag them to write something. So if they were doing their own PR, like that is never going to be their skill set. But I've got others that was like, I will write everything you ask me to. I just don't want to be on camera. I don't want to speak. So in the real beginning, if you're not working with a one-to-one PR, in the real beginning, it's got to be something that you want to do. Otherwise, you're not going to do it. So what are your skill sets? So are you a natural writer? Are you a speaker? It's also then going to come into your like working week. So like we were talking at the start of the episode before we hit record about like you batch recording podcasts. Now I've got some clients that do like 9 to 5 with clients, so they can't jump on those urgent requests because they're literally in sessions. But they could absolutely, batch book podcasts. Or are you the sort of person that actually that's going to take too long, but you could do like 10 minutes every day? And in that case, maybe we focus on creating some quick quotes that we pitch to the media. So you need to have a look at like, okay, what's my working week like? Where are people actually finding me from? What is my strength? And then the final one is like what results you actually want to get. So for example, we know that PR really helps people with their Google ranking and SEO. So if that is a big focus for you, like it's not for me, I don't focus on SEO. I have before in previous businesses, but right now I know that most people will find me from articles like Facebook groups, masterminds, podcasts. I'm not focusing on people typing in certain words, but loads of people, SEO is a massive priority. If they're a product business or they're a niche or they're a local business in particular, they want to rank first for like photographer, Warwickshire or whatever. So in that case, we know that getting links from places like The Guardian and the Daily Mail really helps our SEO. And I could talk for ages about that, but we'll just take that as a statement for now, otherwise we'll detour. So then, okay, that makes sense that actually online has to be the priority, doesn't it? Similarly, you might know that actually my biggest focus is to grow my Instagram. So in that case, would it make sense more to do PR that perhaps publications that have an Instagram presence or podcasts because they're going to tag you in the Instagram. And so it's making sure that when you speak to that journalist, you're asking for the right credit. So where do you want to drive people towards? And then what do you want the next steps of it to be? So for me, like if I'm on a podcast, I would probably always say to come over to my Instagram because I know that's where most people connect with me. So I would make sure every time I'm on a podcast, can you put my Instagram link? If my focus was, getting traffic to my website because I've got a great freebie, every single time you speak to a journalist, you need to say to them, here's my credit, Jenna Farmer, founder of jennafarmerpr.co.uk. So you've got to be strategic about it. Where do you want people to go? And then what is the next step after that? So, okay, you're getting all this coverage for your website, but you forgot that you've got a website, which I often do, and you haven't updated it in so long, there's no freebie. So it's just really thinking strategically. I've had some clients that have said, can we just put a Facebook group link in? Because I know that it's such a quick win to get people to my Facebook group and they will buy from me. Or can we mention my podcast? Because when someone listens to my podcast, they become a real loyal person. So if you've got all the time in the world or you're working with a one-to-one PR, try absolutely everything. I really encourage you to try all different things and then maybe, a quarter in, review, like what's worked well, what's brought an audience in. But if you don't have hardly any time, then you'll need to be strategic from the beginning. But you can also review, like I said, let's say you do all these podcasts, but you realise that no one actually comes into your audience from them. So then it might be, I'm going to write articles. So don't leave it a year or two until you realise I've done, I see all these posts like I'm going to do 50 podcasts this year and all those different things. If you get to the end of the year and you realise no one is listening to podcasts or no one's coming to your audience from them, then it's sort of pointless. So just keep tracking and being strategic and also asking your audience. So I imagine most people's audience do listen to podcasts, but asking the audience, what do you listen to? What do you read? And try and get an idea of where your existing audience are hanging out because maybe more ideal clients will be there as well.
Yeah. Amazing. Great advice. So final piece of advice for our listeners then. What's the one final thing that you would say to our listeners in terms of approaching their PR goals or visibility goals, and their, bearing in mind their mindset as well?
So I would say that a lot of business owners, particularly women, but I don't want to stereotype, but it often is women, they feel as if it's like a tiered approach. So, as someone said to me yesterday, like, I would love to be in psychology. So do I go to like my local newspaper first and then do I work my way up? And it doesn't work like that. So, I've had people, someone was in my membership and they got the first press opportunity they got was Forbes. Now, I'm not saying that is like my selling point. I'm not saying that always happens, but it's not linear. Forbes needed somebody and she was like, I'll do it. And I've got a quote. And that leads me to my second point. There are so many women, again in particular, who are so cautious about calling themselves the expert because, as I said earlier, journalists don't want to hear things like, your BFF or your like no BS guide. What actually are you in factual terms? I am a PR expert. The easiest thing to call yourself if you are a service business is an expert of something. You don't have to change like your copy on your website or your Instagram, but for the media, what are you the expert in? And so many people find that uncomfortable. They might call themselves like a coach or a strategist, but the minute you tell a journalist, I am the expert, it will get so much easier because it goes back to what I said before. What does a coach mean to a journalist? Not that much to every journalist. What does a coach do? How do they work with people? It can be different and the journalist might not understand. So simply by, just taking that step, not feeling like you need permission to pitch those higher places, just stepping into being the expert. And, so much of PR is someone saying, I'll do it, I'm the expert and I'll give it a go. It's not about, so many people are like, why am I competitor getting the coverage? Because they've gone, I'll do it and I'll send a pitch. And the journalist isn't going to go, let me compare 100 experts and see who's the best. They're like, I've got an hour, you're an expert, let's do it. And it often is that simple. It's just about giving yourself permission to just really step in and be that person. And as soon as you are and you don't overcomplicate it, it will just get so much easier.
Love that. Have the self-confidence, self-belief, know that you are the expert in your field and go for it. Just put yourself out there. I think it's so important to do so, isn't it?
Really, really is. And I always share this example. I have a client that is a brain expert, and when Princess Anne fell off her horse and she had concussion, going back to the thing we talked about earlier, I had the news alert. So I reached out to all the newspapers and I was like, I have got the expert. She's got like degrees and she's super experienced. But there was a man that had got there first who was like, I'll do it. And he wasn't a brain expert. He was like a royal fan. So he was like, she'll be fine. Based on like his royal knowledge rather than like actual understanding of the brain and concussion. But he just went, I'll do it. And so I had to say, look, we actually can explain how the brain works and concussion. But that's just an example of someone saying, well, I can talk about it. I follow the royals and I can talk about the royals, even though he didn't know anything about the brain. And a lot of PR is that people saying, I'll do it, I can talk about it. And so was that person the best qualified to talk about it? No, but he went, I'll do it. And he gave some quotes. And thankfully, I was able to jump in with who I think was amazingly qualified. But that is often the way of the media, people, saying, I can talk about it. And I get so many random requests. Like I had one the other day, like an expert on Chinese takeaways that we're looking for. And I was like, I'll do it. Like, there's so many things where you think, who is an expert in that? But the journalists are looking for experts in absolutely everything. And the people that are getting the opportunities, so I'm not saying to lie, I'm just saying that, don't feel that you can't call yourself an expert until you've got X number of clients, X amount of money, if you're a limited company, all those different things. If you are talking about it day to day and helping people and solving that problem, then you absolutely are the expert in it.
Absolutely. I love this. Jenna, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here on the podcast. I've really enjoyed diving into this conversation and looking more at the perspective of the mindset, the self-beliefs, and ultimately then the process that people should go through in order to get themselves out there, get them more visible and really go for it in terms of PR. Before we wrap up the episode, I always ask every single guest this one question. What is your one word of the year and why?
So I don't usually do the word of the year, but I have this year because my word, yeah, because I just think like, what am I going to say? But this year, I really want to do and go to more in-person events. So I just decided it would be in person. I know it's not much of an adjective, but it's just a commitment to myself to go in more places, deliver more things in person, go to in-person events, because I just think they're just becoming more and more important for business owners. So I'm just committing to showing up to more, to delivering more of what I can in person, because I just think it's really important.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And where can our listeners find you and connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram, which is at Jenna Farmer PR. I've got a Facebook group called Get Your Business in the Media with Jenna Farmer. I have a podcast called PR in Your Pocket, and I have a membership called the Momentum Media Club. That was quite
amazing. Go and give Jenna a follow. She's incredible at what she does. She's an absolute expert, a wealth of knowledge. All of her links and notes are in the show notes as well. So go and give them a read. Go and check out her membership as well. Absolutely. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
And thank you for everyone that's tuned into today's episode. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And I'll see you all again next time. Thank you for tuning in to the Actually I Can Female Entrepreneur podcast with me, your host, Kayleigh Greenacre. If you are ready to build, grow, and scale your dream six-figure or multi-six-figure business, then head to our website now for more information or connect with me on socials to see how you can create your dream business and dream life.